My God, this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend, starting now.
The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems through what they euphemistically called diplomatic negotiations, though anyone with half a brain cell knew it was really just elaborate bullying with starships. For 3 centuries, they'd maintained their grip on galactic politics through a charming combination of technological superiority and an unshakable belief that might makes right. Their society revolved around honored duels, physical prowess, and the deeply held conviction that anyone who couldn't bench press a small moon was clearly inferior genetic material. Captain Vex Corvain embodied everything the Zephyrians held dear. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with muscles that could crack asteroids and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite by a particularly aggressive sculptor, he was the undisputed champion of their honor system. In 237 formal duels, he had never lost. Not once. His victories were the stuff of legend, whispered about in taverns across the galaxy where beings gathered to discuss the futility of challenging Zephyrian supremacy. Nexus Station, the galaxy's premier diplomatic hub, buzzed with its usual mixture of interstellar politics and barely contained violence. The station's neutral status meant that even the most bloodthirsty species had to play nice, at least officially. Unofficially, of course, everyone still plotted against everyone else, just with better manners and fancier clothing. The arrival of the human diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge caused about as much excitement as a tax audit. Most species regarded humans as the galactic equivalent of that neighbor who borrows your lawnmower and returns it with a blade dull, mildly annoying, but ultimately harmless. They were new to the interstellar scene, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, which in galactic terms made them barely past the cute but useless stage of development. Ambassador Thane Blackwood stepped off the transport with the casual confidence of someone who had seen enough diplomatic catastrophes to find them mildly entertaining rather than terrifying. His security chief, Commander Myacross, followed 2 steps behind, her eyes constantly scanning for threats with the practiced paranoia that kept diplomats alive in a galaxy where cultural misunderstanding often ended with someone getting vaporized. Cross was unremarkable by most galactic standards, average height, lean build, with the kind of practical features that suggested she spent more time in combat training than beauty salons. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation knot, and her uniform was spotless but showed the subtle wear patterns that marked it as actual working gear rather than ceremonial dress. To the Zephyrians, she looked like a child playing dress-up in soldier clothes. "Behold," Captain Corvain announced to his entourage as the humans made their way through the station's main concourse, the mighty warriors of Earth. His voice carried the particular brand of condescension that came from never having been punched hard enough to recalibrate one's attitude. "I've seen more muscle mass on a vegan tree slug." The Zephyrian delegation erupted in laughter, the sound echoing through the station's crystalline corridors like the barking of particularly obnoxious seals. Other species made polite conversation while secretly calculating whether humans might be useful as allies, slaves, or appetizers, depending on their particular cultural inclinations. The formal negotiations took place in Conference Hall 7, a circular chamber designed to minimize the psychological advantages of seating arrangements. Fat lot of good that did when one delegation looked like they could arm wrestle a gravity well, and the other looked like they'd struggle with opening a particularly stubborn jar of pickles. "The Terran Federation seeks only peaceful cooperation," Ambassador Blackwood began, his voice carrying the diplomatic equivalent of a white flag. "We believe that mutual understanding and respect form the foundation of all successful interstellar relationships." Captain Corvain lounged in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by hitting it very hard. "Respect, you say? Interesting concept, coming from a species that couldn't fight their way out of a soap bubble." He gestured dismissively at Commander Cross. "Is this the best warrior your people have to offer? She looks like she'd lose a fight with a gentle breeze." Cross remained perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in parade rest. Her expression gave away nothing, but anyone who knew humans well enough to read the subtle tension around her eyes might have started backing toward the exits. "Commander Cross is here in a security capacity," Blackwood replied smoothly, "not as a representative of our military capabilities." "Military capabilities," Corvain repeated, savoring the words like a fine wine. How deliciously optimistic. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow half the room. "Perhaps your security chief would care to demonstrate these capabilities in a proper contest of strength." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Every species present recognized the signs of an impending honor challenge, and most started making mental notes about property insurance claims and next-of-kin notifications. "I'm sure that won't be necessary," Blackwood said, his diplomatic training warring with a growing suspicion that his security chief was about to do something spectacularly inadvisable. "Necessary? No," Corvain agreed, circling the negotiation table like a predator who had just spotted a particularly juicy prey animal. "But educational? Absolutely." He stopped directly behind Cross, his shadow engulfing her completely. "What say you, little human? Care to learn why your species should show proper respect to their betters?" Cross turned slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was level, professional, and absolutely devoid of the fear that everyone expected. "Are you challenging me to a formal duel, Captain?" The question hung in the air, like a loaded weapon. Corvain's smile widened, revealing teeth that looked capable of biting through hull plating. How wonderfully direct. "Yes, little human, I am challenging you to a formal duel under Zephyrian honor code. Unless, of course, your courage is as diminutive as your stature." And then he made his mistake. With casual contempt, Captain Corvain raised his massive hand and delivered a sharp, dismissive slap across Cross's cheek. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, sharp and final and utterly humiliating. It was the kind of slap designed not just to sting but to shame, to reduce a person to something small and powerless in front of witnesses. The sound of his slap still hung in the air when Cross responded. Not with words or protests or diplomatic outrage, but with her fist connecting with Corvain's jaw in a punch that carried every ounce of human stubbornness, military training, and barely controlled fury that had been building since the moment she'd set foot on this station. "Actually, that's getting ahead of ourselves." The punch came later, after what the diplomatic corps would forever refer to as the longest 47 minutes in recorded galactic history. First came the formal acceptance of the challenge, delivered by Cross in a voice so calm it made seasoned diplomats nervous. Then came the elaborate ceremonial preparations that Zephyrian honor code demanded, including the ritual exchange of weapons. Cross politely declined the traditional warhammer in favor of bare-handed combat, the formal witnessing by representatives of at least 3 neutral species, and the tedious recitation of honor protocols that dated back to when the Zephyrians were still figuring out fire. The arena was a circular platform 50 meters in diameter, surrounded by energy barriers that would contain the violence while allowing spectators an unobstructed view of what everyone assumed would be a very brief and one-sided educational demonstration. Word had spread throughout the station with the speed that gossip achieves in closed environments, and beings from dozens of species gathered to witness the spectacle. Betting was heavily against the human, with odds reaching astronomical levels. The Crystalline Collective offered 10,000 to 1 against Cross lasting more than 30 seconds. The Merchant Guild of Proxima Prime started taking bets on how many pieces she'd be in when Corvain was finished with her. Even the normally optimistic Andromedan Peace Corps put their money on a quick Zephyrian victory, though they did so with the kind of sad resignation usually reserved for watching someone's pet goldfish attempt deep-sea exploration. Commander Cross entered the arena wearing standard military fatigues, and what could charitably be described as a complete lack of concern for her own mortality. She moved with the efficient economy of someone who had spent years learning how to hurt people professionally, but against Corvain's imposing bulk. She looked like a child who had wandered into an adult competition by mistake. Captain Corvain, resplendent in ceremonial combat gear that probably cost more than most planets' annual military budgets, played to the crowd with the shameless enthusiasm of a born showman. He flexed muscles that could crush stone, demonstrated punching combinations that generated their own wind patterns, and generally conducted himself like someone who had never entertained the possibility of losing. "Any last words, little human?" he called out, his voice amplified by the arena's acoustics to properly dramatic levels. Cross considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, which was none whatsoever. "Yeah," she replied, settling into a combat stance that looked disturbingly professional to anyone who knew what to look for. "Try not to cry when this is over." The crowd erupted in laughter, the sound cascading through the arena like breaking glass. Even some of the human diplomatic staff chuckled nervously, though Ambassador Blackwood noticed that Cross's comment hadn't been delivered with the bravado of someone trying to convince themselves they weren't about to die horribly. It had been spoken with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact, like mentioning that space was cold or that politicians were generally untrustworthy. The duel began with all the subtlety of a supernova. Corvain exploded into motion with a fluid violence that had made him legendary, crossing half the arena in 3 massive strides and launching an attack sequence that should have ended the fight before Cross's nervous system could properly register what was happening. His first punch created a visible shockwave and would have removed her head from her shoulders if it had connected. It didn't connect. Cross wasn't where the punch expected her to be. She had moved with a fluidity that seemed almost lazy, except that it had placed her exactly where Corvain's attack couldn't reach her. His follow-up combination met the same fate, finding nothing but empty air where a human should have been getting pulverized into her component molecules. For the first few minutes, the fight looked exactly like everyone had predicted. Corvain dominated the space, his massive frame generating attacks that would have demolished small buildings, while Cross played the part of the overmatched underdog, dodging and weaving and generally looking like someone who was postponing the inevitable through superior footwork and what appeared to be blind luck. The crowd began to grow restless. They had come to see a demonstration of Zephyrian superiority, not a prolonged chase scene. Corvain, sensing their mood, began to showboat more aggressively, his attacks growing flashier and more dramatic as he sought to end the fight with suitable style. This was his second mistake, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. Cross, meanwhile, was doing what humans did best in impossible situations. She was learning. Every dodge taught her something about Corvain's reach and timing. Every near miss refined her understanding of his preferred attack patterns. She was treating the duel like a very dangerous educational experience, and Captain Corvain was providing an excellent curriculum in advanced Zephyrian combat techniques. The first hint that something had changed came when Cross stopped retreating. Corvain launched what should have been a finishing combination, a devastating series of strikes that would have overwhelmed any conventional defense. Instead of backing away, Cross stepped forward, inside the arc of his attacks, and delivered a sharp jab to his solar plexus. It wasn't enough to do serious damage, but it was precise, perfectly timed, and entirely unexpected. Corvain stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, while the crowd fell silent. That hadn't looked like luck. That had looked like skill. The next few minutes revealed a disturbing truth about human combat philosophy. Where Zephyrians fought with overwhelming force and intimidating displays of power, humans fought with efficiency, adaptability, and a casual disregard for their own safety that bordered on the psychotic. Cross began to press her attack, not with the desperate fury of someone who knew they were outmatched, but with the methodical precision of a professional who had found her opponent's weaknesses and intended to exploit them thoroughly. Corvain's size and strength, which had seemed so overwhelming at the beginning of the fight, gradually revealed themselves as limitations. His attacks, while devastating, followed predictable patterns. His massive frame, while impressive, made him a larger target and slowed his recovery time between strikes. Most importantly, his entire fighting philosophy was built around intimidation and quick victories against opponents who would be paralyzed by fear. Commander Cross, it turned out, had not received the memo about being properly intimidated. She began to land hits with increasing frequency, each strike precisely targeted at nerve clusters, joint connections, and pressure points that Zephyrian anatomy shared with most bipedal species. Her attacks weren't designed to show off or to demonstrate superior strength. They were designed to hurt, to slow down her opponent, and to gradually strip away his advantages through accumulated damage. The crowd's mood shifted from bloodthirsty anticipation to confused concern. This wasn't how honor duels were supposed to work. The smaller, weaker opponent was supposed to lose quickly and spectacularly, not systematically dismantle the champion through what appeared to be applied xenoanatomy and in concerning disregard for personal safety. Corvain, finding himself in the unprecedented position of being hurt in a formal duel, responded the way bullies typically do when their victims fight back. He got angry. His attacks became wilder, more aggressive, driven by fury rather than technique. This was exactly what Cross had been waiting for. Anger made people stupid. Stupid people made mistakes. And Cross had spent her entire military career learning how to punish mistakes with extreme prejudice. The end came suddenly. Corvain, frustrated and increasingly desperate, overcommitted to a massive haymaker that would have shattered concrete. Cross ducked under the punch, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a perfectly executed uppercut that connected with the underside of his jaw with a sound like thunder. The punch carried every ounce of human determination, every hour of training, every accumulated frustration from sitting through diplomatic meetings where beings who'd never won a fight in their lives called her species weak. It was a punch that started in her toes, traveled up through her legs and core and shoulders, and arrived at Corvain's jaw with a force of righteous indignation made kinetic. Captain Vex Corvain, undefeated champion of the Zephyrian Empire, dropped like a sack of particularly dense rocks. The silence that followed was a kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or apocalypse. Several hundred beings from dozens of different species stared at the impossible tableau. The mighty Zephyrian champion unconscious on the arena floor, and a human woman standing over him, shaking the sting out of her knuckles with the casual air of someone who had just completed a routine maintenance task. Cross looked down at the fallen champion, then up at the stunned crowd, and shrugged. "Told you not to cry," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. The arena erupted into chaos. The crystalline collective representatives began frantically calculating bankruptcy procedures. The Merchant Guild of Proxima Prime started offering new bets on whether Corvain would wake up sometime this century. The Andromedan Peace Corps delegates looked around at each other with a pleased expression of beings whose faith in universal justice had been unexpectedly validated. Ambassador Blackwood, who had spent the entire fight alternating between diplomatic horror and professional admiration, stepped forward with the calm efficiency of someone who had just seen an impossible diplomatic victory fall into his lap. "I believe," he said to the still-stunned Zephyrian delegation, "we were discussing terms of mutual cooperation." The negotiations that followed were notably more respectful than the initial meeting. It's amazing how a good punch to the jaw can clarify complex diplomatic positions. The Zephyrians, faced with the uncomfortable reality that their fundamental assumptions about human weakness had been violently corrected, found themselves much more interested in partnership than domination. Captain Corvain, when he finally regained consciousness several hours later, discovered that the galaxy had moved on without him. The recording of his defeat had already become the most watched entertainment file in 17 star systems, with particular popularity among species who had previously been on the receiving end of Zephyrian diplomatic negotiations. The Terran Federation found itself elevated from galactic afterthought to serious player overnight. Species that had barely acknowledged human existence suddenly became very interested in establishing embassy exchanges and mutual defense agreements. Nobody wanted to risk ending up on the wrong side of beings who could make the Zephyrian champion take an unscheduled nap with a single punch. Commander Cross, for her part, seemed utterly bemused by the attention. When asked by reporters about her victory strategy, she gave the kind of answer that military professionals everywhere recognized as completely honest and utterly terrifying. "I hit him until he stopped moving. It's not complicated." The irony, of course, was that the Zephyrians had been absolutely correct about one thing: might did make right in galactic politics. They had simply made the fundamental error of assuming they were the mightiest beings in the galaxy. As it turned out, they had never encountered a species that combined advanced technology with a stubborn refusal to admit when they were outmatched. Humans, as the galaxy was learning, had perfected the art of being unreasonably difficult to kill. They had spent their entire evolutionary history on a planet that actively tried to murder them on a daily basis, had survived ice ages and volcanic winters and mass extinctions, and had somehow concluded from all of this that the appropriate response to overwhelming odds was to punch them in the face and see what happened. The sound of Captain Corvain's slap had indeed hung in the air, but it had been thoroughly overshadowed by the much more significant sound of Commander Cross's fist connecting with his jaw. In galactic politics, as in playground disputes, it turned out that the last punch thrown usually settled the argument. The Zephyrian Empire would eventually adapt to this new reality, because the alternative was finding out what happened when an entire species of beings who had survived everything their homeworld could throw at them decided you were the next problem that needed solving. Other species, observing this development with the keen interest of beings who preferred their civilizations intact, began reassessing their own diplomatic strategies accordingly. And somewhere in the depths of space, on planets where beings had spent centuries convinced that strength was measured in size and intimidation, the recording of a human woman knocking out the galaxy's greatest warrior continued to play, over and over, like a very pointed lesson in the danger of underestimating one's opponents. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor after all. It just expressed it through violence and diplomatic reversals, like some cosmic stand-up comedian with a particularly dark sense of timing. Sometimes the best diplomatic solution really was hitting your problems until they stopped moving.